Hey, good evening and welcome to the Oakland Police Department's continued series of online open access meetings to members of our community. This evening's opportunity for transparency and discussion is to introduce OPD's data collection, our data management, and our review process to create, improve, and sustain the best policing practices possible in our city through responsible and good use of data. Also, a bit of great leadership direction from your local area commanders. Before I turn this over to Mayor Schaaf, who we owe thanks to helping coordinate this town hall type style community engagement opportunity, I want to thank also members of our staff and invite members of the community that as we continue through tonight, if you have questions for the chat, please enter them. We will be ending tonight with a question and answer session. Also, just to make sure that everybody involved is aware that this meeting is being recorded, including all the dialogue there within, as well as the chat. And that's also being viewed live on several different platforms. Our plan is to rebroadcast this so that others unable to join us tonight are able to continually learn and share and immerse themselves into this project as well. So with that, I want to introduce Mayor Schaaf. Thank you, Mayor, again. And the unmute button is yours.
Thank you, Chief Bolton. Oakland, it is wonderful to be with you this evening to kind of delve into the data that we collect to understand policing's impact on the community and to create an early warning system to identify trends that are unacceptable or that we want to celebrate, to try and identify opportunities for us to correct individual officers' behavior, squads, or our policies. And I want to take responsibility that for too long, we have operated with policies that are not aligned with Oaklanders' values. We believe that Oakland, California is the city that is going to lead this nation in this inflection point, this moment for a demand to reimagine public safety, to really understand what safety and justice means for every Oaklander, especially the ones who have been harmed by law enforcement in the past. We acknowledge and apologize for that harm. And we are doing what is in our power right now and everything going forward to make up for that, to repair, to restore, and to progress to the most progressive police department in America. That is our quest. I want to acknowledge that we're going to talk a lot about data tonight, numbers, statistics. It seems very impersonal, but behind each one of these numbers is a human interaction, an emotional experience, whether it's someone who has called the police in their moment of crisis, or whether it's an interaction that has felt unjust or heavy-handed or too aggressive. This is what this data is trying to get underneath. I want to add my appreciation to Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt of Stanford University. Her wisdom and just innovation in looking at how we can use data to dismantle not just explicit bias, but implicit or unconscious bias, the systemic bias, the policies that lead to disparities, both in policing outcomes and in the delivery of justice and safety. That work is ongoing. This is not a finished product. This is a conversation that we want you, the community, at the table leading. Hopefully today you will learn enough about what the ingredients are that we are working with, that we can work together to build community trust in law enforcement and in our governmental systems, as well as lead us to that systemic and transformative change that we all seek. With that, it is my pleasure to turn the Zoom room over to Oakland's first homegrown police chief, Chief LaRon Armstrong. Thank you so much for stepping forward in this moment to lead the Oakland Police Department and to lead the safety conversation in our city. Chief Armstrong.
Thank you, Mayor. That was a wonderful foundation for what we're going to experience tonight. One of the things I will say is that when I took over the Oakland Police Department on February 9th, selected by the Police Commission to be forwarded to the mayor for her eventual selection as police chief. First, it was an honor to be selected, but also it came in with a very clear mandate that this department would move forward towards compliance with the negotiated settlement agreement. It also moved forward with holding ourselves accountable. And tonight we'll be bringing forth the ways in which we hold ourselves accountable, hold our officers accountable, and make sure that our actions are consistent with the values of the Oakland Police Department, but also consistent with the values of the city of Oakland. I must say I'm really proud of the work that's been done by our team. I think Deputy Chief Bolton, his team of Dr. Grossman, as well as our other staff has done a phenomenal job of preparing tonight's presentation to really demonstrate how closely we look at the actions and decisions of our officers and how we're doing our best to make sure that we are intervening in any at-risk behavior on behalf of our officers and giving clear guidance and redirection on how we're going to improve as a police department to provide the most legitimate police services we can provide to the city of Oakland and its residents. So tonight, my staff is here with me to help us go through this presentation, as well as answer questions that may come from community and others. Really, this is the foundation for ensuring that our practices every day are in line with our policies, that our officers are going out every day doing things the way we're asking them to do. And our command staff will speak to specific ways in which they use this data, specific ways in which this data allows them to better understand the actions that are happening in our community every day. Again, like the mayor said, these are numbers, but on the other side of these numbers are people that we've come in contact with, people who have had an experience with law enforcement. And so we want to make sure that each one of these experiences is meaningful, that it's a positive experience. And so as we seek to improve as a department and seek to be a model for agencies across the country, this risk management process that we're going to present to you tonight, we believe is the foundation for continuous accountability. So first, I'd like to introduce my executive team that will be with us this evening. First, I'll be introducing Assistant Chief of Police Darren Allison. Chief Allison is responsible for all the day-to-day operations of the Oakland Police Department running. He is the executive in charge of all the bureau commanders. Next, we have Deputy Chief of Police Christopher Bolton. He's responsible for the Bureau of Field Operations 1, which includes all of areas 1, 2, and 3, which essentially is West Oakland all the way until the Fruitvale border. That includes the borders of both North Oakland, Berkeley, as well as Alameda. Next is Deputy Chief Nishant Joshi, responsible for the Bureau of Field Operations East. Deputy Chief Joshi is responsible for Fruitvale all the way until the San Leandro border. Next up is Deputy Chief of Police Drennan Lindsay. She is responsible for our Criminal Investigations Bureau. And Chief Lindsay is responsible for all investigations, criminal investigations for the entire Oakland Police Department, which includes homicides, felony assaults, domestic violence, and all of our human trafficking investigations, as well as all criminal investigations for our department. Next up is our Deputy Chief of Bureau of Fish Risk Management, Deputy Chief Angelica Mendoza. Deputy Chief Mendoza is responsible for all risk-related bureaus, including the Internal Affairs Division, our Office of Inspector Generals, our PASS unit, and our Training Division. Next is Deputy Director Kiana Settle, our, our highest ranking non-sworn member, our professional staff executive. She's responsible for our Bureau of Services, which includes our Communications Division, our Records Division, as well as our Fiscal Division, our Human Resources section. With that, I'll be pass it over to Assistant Chief Allison to explain to you tonight what our risk management process looks like and what it covers.
Thank you, Chief. And definitely you set the stage for a lot of what we do as far as managing risk. As noted, as a learning organization, we're constantly evaluating ourselves, the data that we collect, and we certainly collect a very wide depth of data. And although we talk about numbers, certainly there is actions and meaning in what we do behind those numbers. And so when it comes to risk management, we look at, and risk mitigation, we look at all sorts of areas of risk, really to identify, prevent, and mitigate those areas that pose risk, and not only to public safety practices, but looking at policies and outcomes. And in our effort not only to be a learning and growing organization, to be the best at what we do, but we also want to maintain organizational legitimacy with the community that we police, and be as effective as possible. And so some of the areas that we look at include stop data, uses of force, internal affairs complaints, pursuits, collisions. Those are some of the big areas of risk that we cover when we look at data. But it doesn't just stop there. We also cover other performance indicators that are connected to our personnel assessment system, which looks at other areas regarding civil suits, case evaluation reports, and a multitude of other dimensions that we can assess. Again, as an organization, we do collect a lot of data, but we're really trying to figure out what's driving that data, what we can do to pull levers to reduce risk and mitigate risk is essentially what our goal is. Just to give you a little overview for the members of the community and the public, we run risk management or risk mitigation meetings every month. They move. One month we may look at citywide risk to look at trends that we can impact either through strategies or policies. And then the following months we look at one side of the city, the west side of the city, and Bureau Field Operations, where we drill in a little bit more in detail, where we move away from that big view and we get a little bit more narrow and focused, where we might look at squad dynamics, individual risk for officers or supervision or command. And then the following month, we look at the other side of the city to include our ceasefire teams. So that's the risk management process. But as indicated, there are other areas that we identify and assess risk. As I mentioned, our personnel assessment system evaluates 20 dimensions that are peer group threshold comparisons. So if we see outlying individual performance, we do reviews and we evaluate them, which then can result in monitoring type programs or intervention type programs, or no action if we really believe that the outliers aren't driven by areas of risk. We also engage in internal audits and reviews carried out by the Office of Inspector General. We certainly have requirements for our body-worn camera footage that results in reviews, not only policy-driven reviews, but assessment reviews. We have our health and wellness unit. It's constantly evaluating stress on members throughout the organization and how we mitigate that stress to ensure that we're at our top peak performance. We engage in force review boards, and we'll talk a little bit more about force when we get further along in the presentation, as well as publishing annual and quarterly stop data reports, and engaging in what we consider management level liaisons, which are our reports, which are referrals from the district attorney's office or public defender's office when there may be criminal cases that are being prosecuted that might be dismissed for concerning means related to report writing or evidence collection. To add on top of that, I know that it's a lot, but we again are constantly evaluating how we manage risk as an organization to solidify the foundation and legitimacy. We have recently created our Bureau of Risk Management, which is led by Deputy Chief Angelica Mendoza, which has co-aligned all functions within the organization that support performance accountability, growth, development, as well as identification of risk. And so we aligned our Internal Affairs Division, our Inspector General's Office, our Training Division, as well as our Personnel Assessment System Unit, or PAS unit, and created, in addition, our risk assessment or risk analysis, risk impact units, which look at, again, stop data, use of force, granular details, and identifying and analyzing those risk outliers. To support that effort, we actually hired our first data scientist, Dr. Grossman, who I believe, I don't know if she was introduced, but is definitely on the call. Dr. Grossman has experience in how we look at data, and she is a value asset added to our risk management strategies in looking at the nuances of outlying risk and our analysis that support that. And then another initiative that we created was our Violent Crimes Operations Center, which aligns a lot of our enforcement teams or crime reduction teams together under one command to support intel-driven policing. So we are highly focused in mitigating individuals that are carrying out violent crimes without over-policing our communities and our neighborhoods. And the Violent Crime Operations Center and their teams work very closely and collaboratively with our ceasefire personnel, who not only engage in enforcement, but work with our community partners and our community-based organizations, as well as Department of Violence Prevention, to engage in intervention strategies on individuals that have the highest propensity for violence. So all these initiatives working together really try and help mitigate risk, analyze risk, and again, provide the best service we can to the community while enhancing and increasing our trust and legitimacy with the community. So I want to take a few moments to just cover those areas. Some have been in existence for a while, and some are new initiatives. With that, I'll turn it back over to the Chief and Chief Bolton.
Thank you. And they have just commenced tearing up concrete outside of the police department here. So hopefully people can still hear as we talk from our offices here. Thank you, Chief Allison. Thank you, Chief Armstrong. We can go to the next slide, which I believe is slide number 4. And I'm again prefacing that this is our first attempt to break the ice, so to speak, on the quality and quantity of data that the Oakland Police Department captures. Our first subject of data management and data use is in the field of stop data. And this is a chart just showing one of literally thousands of ways that the Oakland Police Department can look at different types of stops. This demonstrates the difference between a dispatch stop, that is a stop that occurs as it is associated with a call for service or a 911 call, versus a non-dispatch stop, which might be something that an officer in the field views, or something just entirely unrelated, maybe related to a criminal investigation, follow-up, so on and so forth. This also shows that we can look at different categories of stops and different groups of officers. So this is a very high level where we're looking at officers assigned to 6 distinct units or areas, because we have ceasefire in there, but Oakland, and this can kind of get confusing, but Oakland is divided by 2 Bureau field operations, a total of 5 areas. In the chat, I did post a link to a map and a description of where those areas lie. And also we see stops made by our ceasefire units. I do want to take the opportunity to do a quick introduction to the commanders who are responsible for these areas and units. It is their decision-making, their use of data that not only brings public safety and crime reduction to Oakland's neighborhoods, but the reliance on this data and the resulting discussions to ensure that we are doing so in ways that are viewed as fair, impartial, just, and equitable. So for Area 1, Captain Hookfin, if you could just give a quick introduction and then we'll move on down the line.
Good evening, everyone. I am Captain Bobby Hookfin. I am in my 24th year, the Oakland Police Department. I am a proud product of Oakland and a proud Skyline graduate. My Area 1 consists of West Oakland and downtown Oakland, from West Grand to Embarcadero, and to the west side of the lake, which probably stops at like 12th and Fallon. And so I command that entire area, and have been doing so for the last year or so. Also worked in Area 1 as a special resource lieutenant. So I'm very familiar with the ins and outs of downtown, West Oakland, Prescott area. And so, and I enjoy working with, especially the folks in West Oakland. They are so proud and entrenched with their history and the roots in West Oakland. So very proud to be able to serve as their area commander. Thank you, Deputy Chief Bolton.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Rosen. I'm an acting captain currently assigned to Area 2. Area 2 is just above Area 1. So we cover policing services from the Emeryville and Berkeley border all the way out to the west side of Lake Merritt, from approximately 40th Street, so just above Uptown, all the way to the Berkeley border. Presently, I'm in my 16th year in law enforcement here at OPD. I'm proud second generation Oakland police officer. My father served at the department for over 25 years, and my brother also works here as well. Thank you for your time.
Good evening. It's Jake Bassett. I'm the Area 3 captain. For the public, Area 3 is Central Oakland, and it's from Lake Merritt out to Fruitvale and 35th Ave, and then from the estuary up through the hills. Thank you, Chief.
And Captain Beer from Area 4 is with us as well.
Good evening. I'm Captain Beer. I've been with the Oakland Police Department for 24 years. I'm the Area 4 captain. I just recently inherited it from Deputy Chief Mendoza, so I'm very excited to be the commander of the area that I live in. I've been a proud Oakland resident for 25 years. My area consists of basically Fruitvale Avenue and part of 35th Avenue East, down to the water's edge and back up the skyline, with a good portion extending to 78th Avenue and then back down to Cortland. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having us.
And our Area 5 captain, Captain Eric Lewis, was unable to be with us tonight, but Area 5 is East Oakland, Nolan Park area. And then we have our ceasefire commander, Captain Tony Jones, with us as well.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Captain Tony Jones. I lead our ceasefire division within OPD. For those that don't know, ceasefire is a partnership between OPD and the community to address gun violence in our city. Specifically within OPD, I lead 3 teams that are focused on collecting the intelligence that's needed for the entire police department to focus on the individuals that are involved in the gun violence in the city. And so that's what we do in ceasefire. And look forward to the discussion this evening.
Great. And I'm not sure if members of the community see what we put in this chat function or no? Can somebody answer that? There was a texted question, how do I know which area I live in or which beat I live in? There is a map. I put it in the chat version that I have access to here, but I don't know if members of the public can see that. So if somebody could post that in a way that people can use that, you can simply put your address at that website, and it will tell you not only which area you live in, but which beat, and how you can further become involved in your local neighborhood council that meets about public safety and other neighborhood issues.
I'll get right on that, Captain Bolton.
Great, thank you. And I think I can't see the slide, but if we can go to the next slide, I believe that's slide 5. And I'll trust that we're there. Slide 5 shows a view of how our non-dispatched stops from 2017 through the end of 2020 have taken a significant evolution for the better. And this is due to the efforts of the commanders you've just met, the deputy chiefs and the chiefs who have introduced us in this meeting. I would say 2015 was the beginning of our work with Stanford, with Dr. Eberhardt that Chief Armstrong mentioned. We came from a place at that time where, looking at our stop data, it was very apparent that change was needed, that we deserved, our community deserved for us to do a better job with more thoughtful strategies and approaches to public safety, especially when it entails stopping members of our community. So although the vast majority of these changes happened prior to 2017, you can see that even when you start looking at 2017 to the end of 2020, we have reduced the number of our non-dispatch stops by a total of 65% in all. And you can see by the racial breakdown here, African Americans or persons described as Black being that top line that is sort of light blue, but I'm sort of also colorblind, have the largest reduction in stop volume. We call that term a footprint. In other words, when officers are in neighborhoods with the best of intent to make traffic safety better, to bring calm and order to neighborhoods where crime has occurred, to investigate and apprehend criminals where the intelligence and evidence points us, we want to stop fewer people and stop the right people that are causing the disproportionate rates or problems within Oakland's neighborhoods. So although the total number of stops was reduced by 65% in that year-to-year comparison, first year to end year comparison, African Americans stops have been reduced by the largest share. 68% reduction, where the same reductions were not realized for other races. That is really due to one main point, in that in the past, when we responded to crime within neighborhoods, we directed officers to be highly visible, sort of an uncoordinated hotspot approach to policing. We've always used some element of intelligence, but the law, unfortunately, does not require any amount of intelligence be added to a stop designed to impact crime. What we found was that a very large volume of our stops were occurring in neighborhoods for issues such as equipment violations, registration violations, and we rightfully own that. With the use of intelligence, which Captain Jones is going to talk a little bit when we get to some further slides, we were able to better direct, better come up with crime reduction strategies that were more tailored, more focused, and more specific. So while our total number of stops have continued to decrease, our number of arrests within this time, at least through since 2017, have not really been that impacted. And perhaps even more interestingly, and I think importantly, is that we saw things like search rates. The number of times, or the rate at which people were searched was also reduced. The efficacy of these stops were also increased in terms of seizures of evidence or firearms. Last year, 2019, members of this Oakland Police Department recovered 45% more firearms than they had the year prior. And this year we are on pace to recover that same amount. That is while doing fewer stops. That's because they are better stops. And then we'll talk a little bit more about different stops. If we go back to go to slide 6, next slide. And that should be our look at not only our realization that intelligence-based policing is important, but if we're going to change our crime reduction strategies, if we're going to change our direction to officers in the field to value information or intelligence that links a certain stop, an occupant, a driver, to some amount of information before that stop occurs, for a better intent of stop tied to serious and violent crime or some other type of criminal activity, we also want to track that data and capture that data. So we have always collected more stop data than any other police department that I'm aware of. We began much earlier than other police departments, most other police departments. And even though Assembly Bill 953, the bill that and law now that requires all California police departments to collect stop data, we continue to collect more stop data than is required, and we have much more information in terms of our narratives than is required by the law. So our officers are documenting things like what led to the stop. Why was that stop made? What type of crime problem or direction was that stop intended? So slide 6 shows a very simple view of the number on the top, the number of stops per area and for the ceasefire unit, in addition to the percentage of those total non-dispatch stops that are intelligence led, and also the racial breakdown. It is an unfortunate reality that with Oakland's focus on serious and violent crime in the neighborhoods and addressing the crime that we are now faced with, that African Americans are more commonly associated with certain crimes, serious crimes and crimes of violence. That is an issue that deserves more work, more introspection, and more solutions, not only with us here at the police department, but with our partners within the community, parole, probation, district attorney's office, and others. And by no means, if Chief Armstrong didn't say, and I have not said it already, by no means are we saying that we have all the answers. We are not saying that there's no more progress to be made. This is simply a beginning and an acknowledgement that we have a role in policing in a better way, so that if there are disparities, we know that if disparities can be predicted, we implement strategies to prevent stops, to problem solve issues before a stop is necessary, wherever and however possible, and to work better and more collaboratively with others. I do want to take a moment and turn this over to Captain Jones from Ceasefire. You can see on this slide that Ceasefire does a smaller volume of stops compared to the mostly patrol officers in other areas, but the quality of their stops in terms of being led by intelligence and investigations is extremely high at 88%. And I think that he is the perfect person to explain how important intelligence-led policing is in our current crime reduction strategy.
Yes, just to follow up with what Chief Bolton said, we kind of made a significant shift in the department on how we deployed police officers in the field, maybe around 3 or 4 years ago. Prior to our new strategy that's really focused on data and intelligence, when we would have crime spikes or crime surges in certain neighborhoods, the primary tactic we would use to address that will be something, what we call what's known in the profession as hotspot policing, which would mean we would flood a particular area with a lot of cops. They would stop a lot of people. Many of the people probably didn't have anything to do with why we were there in the first place. And what we realized over time is that that tactic alienated a lot of people. While it was well intended, it led to a significant disparity in stops because the gun violence in the homicides in Oakland, they're a lot more common in East Oakland and parts of the city that are occupied by the minority communities. And so what we started doing is switching kind of how the way we did things, realizing that how we police the community is just as or more important than the results that we get or reductions that we get in crime. And so we had a real strong focus on data. We started using the ceasefire model, and the core part of the strategy is what we call a shooting review. And every Thursday, we have a huge meeting where we have everybody in the police department that has anything to do with investigating or enforcing, doing enforcement on gangs or shootings or homicides. And we discuss all of the shootings we had for the previous week. And in these meetings, we have very, very detailed discussions about who is committing the violence. not what location, not how many incidents that we had, but really trying to focus on who is driving the violence. And what we learned through the ceasefire program is that there's really only a small percentage of people committing violence in the city. And so using the data to lead us towards those people and not just coming into neighborhoods with this really broad, wide net approach to address gun violence. We moved away from that and really just started focusing on the data. And that's how we've been able to successfully limit or reduce the number of people that we stop and still maintain certain reductions in crime. And so that's been, like with ceasefire, a lot of, pretty much 80% of our stops, or 88% of our stops are intelligence-based. And what that means is that the people that we're stopping, we know why we're stopping them before we do. We're not just stopping people because they have a tail light or something hanging from the rearview mirror. When we encounter them, we already know what we believe that they're involved in. And those are the kinds of things that we want the police officers at OPD doing rather than making random stops and hoping to get lucky. So I think I'll end it right there, Chief Bolton, and I hope I explained it clear enough. Do you have any questions for me, Chief?
No, you did a great job. And I think not only, I'll tie in your efforts and the efforts of our Violent Crime Operations Center into a slide that we'll be covering later, that not only are we doing fewer stops on the right people, but we're doing so in ways that also look at other potential risks in terms of uses of force, pursuits. We'll be getting into some of that data. And I think you and your officers, as well as the teams of the other commanders on this call, have been able to not only demonstrate that we are more cautious and conscious, I guess, in how we stop, but in the manner in which we make stops that are least likely to cause other risk, if that makes sense. But we'll have more information on that as these slides go. Before we leave this slide, I just want to, I mentioned Stanford before, and I mentioned 2015, that when we started to measure this intelligence-led, we were not doing so through a data-driven approach. We were having to hand look at narratives and actually evaluating why certain stops were being made. When we started in 2015, just to show the progress and the growth of what you're seeing in this chart here, when we started in 2015, a much higher number of stops were being made. And of all the stops within the sample that our Office of Inspector General at the time reviewed, and all the stops that Stanford reviewed, we were somewhere less than 3% of all of our stops could be objectively tied to the crime problems that were impacting those neighborhoods. So when you look at the percentages here of anywhere from 49% in Area 1 all the way up to 88% for ceasefire units, it's a tremendous growth and change. And of course, when you go back to slide 5, you see again that progress that we are proud of. Again, not complete, but works in progress for better policing. If we can go to slide 7, and I'm just going to quickly go over that. Just another way of how we can slice and dice data. Again, there are 1,000 different ways. Our typical risk management meeting, believe it or not, can last, I think our record was 4 hours, and we still really hadn't discussed in detail and in full all the ways that you can assess and discuss data to make sure that we're making the right decisions. But this slide shows that not only have we broken down so far in this demonstration the difference between dispatch stops and non-dispatch stops, the location of stops, but we can also look at how stops in different areas change over time. So this is looking at all of 2020, broken down by quarter. I had planned on turning this over to a captain for some individual input, but we are running over in time. But generally, when we look at how this is broken down in a risk management type data setting, we want to look at not only where these are occurring in the area, but what is the productivity or the volume in type of stop, location of stop, at the squad level, at the officer level. our officers doing things in the way that we are directing, in the manner in which we train and desire for the best outcomes, for the most safety in the best ways possible. If we can go to slide 8. Again, this is a different way of looking at stop data. And again, I'm acknowledging that we're just only scratching the surface here. But another change that, that we started doing actually before Assembly Bill 953, now I believe all California departments are somewhat required to provide this information at a statewide level. But if you go back to when I was explaining back in the past, the 2015 to 2017 and on era, we had a high focus in equipment violations and non-moving violations, including registration stops. I would say, although we didn't capture that data at the time, it was all hand done, I would say the average patrol officer stop was probably somewhere around 30 to 50% likely to be an equipment or in a registration-based stop. Through better direction, through better crime reduction strategies, through more conscious decision-making about what type of stops we want to value, you can see that even between 2019 and 2020, we continued to progress in terms of really not valuing equipment violations and non-moving violations, registration violations, as much as we value moving violations. We are taking this to the next step or the next level with some new partnership with our Department of Transportation here in the city of Oakland. And I don't think we interviewed Captain Fleming, and I'm not sure if he's in here, and that's an oversight of mine. Is Captain Fleming with us? Captain Fleming is currently commanding our Special Operations Division, and he has traffic enforcement. Unfortunately, due to some attempts to bridge some budget shortfalls, we have had some reductions in our traffic enforcement unit, but there's an opportunity there as well. What we saw historically in stop data was that traffic enforcement officers most of them ride motorcycles. The officers who are designated to do most of the traffic safety enforcement in Oakland have historically had better quality stops in terms of stops that are for things like speeding, stop signs, the moving violations that are more typically associated with injury accidents and accidents that unfortunately cause death as well. So now without our traffic enforcement officers, we are looking in partnership with Special Operations Division, formally trained traffic enforcement officers, and the partnership of each of our area commanders. We are trying to get that operational mindset on traffic safety in the patrol officer in terms of focus and dedication. So using data from our Department of Transportation, we'll be focusing in on the top 5 driving behaviors on what is called high injury networks. And so I expect that although COVID has somewhat slowed us down in terms of really being more cautious about when we interact with members of the public and really being cautious about arbitrary type stops, only making stops during COVID times that have the most impact to public safety and that are needed. As we go throughout this year, returning back to normal, and next year, I think we'll begin to see this moving violation rate grow. And also, I think, be able to explain to members of the public that we are out in the neighborhoods focused on the right things and doing things in the best way possible. And then slide 9, if we can move ahead. This is just an acknowledgement of the work that remains to be done. So far we've been mostly talking about non-dispatch stops. Those are also known as discretionary stops. They are, stops that an officer, whether they're intelligence-led or not, an officer is making a decision to make that stop. They're not being directed or called to a scene or directed to stop a vehicle or a person. And so we have really historically put most of our focus on the racial disparities that exist within those discretionary stops. after learning through partnership with Dr. Eberhardt at Stanford that those are the type of stops that are most prone to be influenced by implicit bias. With AB 953, we began collecting dispatch stop data, and we are now eagerly looking at the racial disparities within dispatch stops. It was interesting and problematic that what this slide shows is that the disparities we are now getting with non-dispatch stops closely match those disparities that are seen in dispatch stops. So again, this is not the finish line. This is not OPD saying that that we have accomplished a goal of any sort. This is an acknowledgement that more work needs to be done. And I'll turn this over to Chief Armstrong for any closing arguments on the stop data front before we move on to the other risk management slides.
No, I would simply say that, just know that this is the Oakland Police Department's effort to do the best job we can to reduce disparity in stops. That using intelligence is the best way to be focused and intentional about who you make contact with. We often say that the stop is the entry point to a contact with law enforcement. And so particularly when you have a large number of minority stops, like African-American stops, representing nearly 60%, you want to examine those stops to ensure that you're not touching people that you don't need to touch. And I think what Captain Jones spoke of earlier is how we can address crime, but being focused on those involved in crime, as opposed to touching those that are uninvolved in crime. We know that that has a tremendous impact on our trust in the community, our legitimacy in the community. And so that's why this is so important to examine this data in this way. And, I want to say that the Oakland Police Department is one of the only police departments in the country that can actually establish exactly why they needed to make a specific stop. And so I think that's really important because during the risk management process, we are able to ask our command staff to explain to us why was that stop important for us to make, and does that stop align with our strategies and goals? And so I think that's important to make sure that as officers go out and do their jobs, that they're doing it in a way that's consistent with the department achieving its own goals of reducing violent crime in the city. And so I want to offer that. And then the second thing I'll offer is that being intentional about reducing the number of low-level equipment stops is something that very few departments have been willing to do. I think, the Oakland Police Department has done a phenomenal job of understanding that this is the area that is prime for bias, particularly in communities that may, have some economic issues, low-income areas that may have minor needs on their particular vehicles, but that those stops that are made for those low-level equipment violations may not actually help the department reach its overall goal of addressing violent crime. So we want to make sure our priorities are aligned with our stop behavior, and the data that was just presented to you help us better understand that, help us understand if our officers are doing the things that we expect of them. We often say in the Oakland Police Department, we have to inspect what we expect. And this data helps us inspect our officers' actions. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Chief Bolton.
Thank you, Chief. I see a few stop data type questions coming through, mostly from Facebook, and I see that at last count we have some people monitoring and appreciating this conversation. We're going to see if we can come back to the question and answers and see if we can begin answering some of these in the chat. Let me now we're going to go to a risk management lens, an evaluation of our use of force data with Assistant Chief Allison. Assistant Chief, the mic is yours.
All right, thank you, Chief Bolton. So everyone, the first thing I'm going to do before I go into the next couple slides on the actual data is take an opportunity in a moment to explain our use of force, because it does need some explanation as far as the different levels. So when we talk about force, we classify our force between a level 1 to a level 4, with level 1 use of force being the most serious force to include intentional firearm discharges at a person, weapon strikes through the head of an individual, or force that creates substantial risk of causing death or causing substantial bodily injury. A level 2 use of force is considered an intermediate use of force to include hand strikes to the head of an individual, or hand strikes or weapon strikes to a restrained individual, accidental firearm discharges without injury, impact or baton weapon strikes, canine bites, and force that results in injury. So that would be considered a level 2 use of force. Level 3 uses of force include electronic control weapon or taser deployments, non-striking use of a baton, takedowns on a restrained individual or handcuffed individual, hand strikes to someone's body other than to their head, chemical agents or chemical munition applications on unrestrained individuals. And then level 4 uses of force would be considered our lower types of force to include pointing of a firearm, weaponless defense techniques, which includes control holds or other control techniques, or pain compliance to vulnerable areas, as well as takedowns and canine deployments where there is no bite. So as you can see, we do track and capture a lot of data with a lot of our physical interactions when it comes to addressing members of the public. Now, what the different levels mean is they result in different forms of review, investigation, or assessment. Obviously, the more serious types of force, the more individuals and bodies are brought out to investigate and follow up, as well as review. And then obviously the lower ends of the force, although may not have as serious of an investigation, still gets an opportunity for review. So for example, a level 1 use of force would result in a criminal investigations division and internal affairs and a community police review agency call out to conduct concurrent investigations. And based on their findings, it would get presented before what we consider an executive force review board, which is led by a executive officer, which is considered a deputy chief of police. The board not only looks at the force, but all actions leading up to the force, as well as policy issues, training issues, supervision issues, and other potential policy violations in which they can render a finding of a force being in compliance or out of compliance, and then thereby resulted accountability depending on the outcome. A level 2 use of force requires a supervisor investigation with a presentation to a force review board. A force review board is similar to an executive force review board. It's chaired by a rank of captain or higher. They look at the same factors and events that we would look at in an executive force review board. A level 3 use of force includes a supervisor investigation, which is then reviewed through the chain of command up to a captain. And a level 4 use of force includes a supervisor review, which is assessed by a lieutenant. So I wanted to give the lay of the land of what the different levels mean. Now, as far as the data, as Chief Bolden and Chief Armstrong indicated, we have a field of data that we look at, and certainly with use of force, there is no shortage in data. We look at force as it's applied by every officer for every application for every incident. So you can have essentially one incident where multiple officers are engaged in multiple different types of force. So we can look at it at the most very granular level as well as the most highest level, which is per incident. And so the force that we're looking at on this slide is force that's captured by incident. And it's not only by incident, but it's at the highest level of force reported for that incident. So when we look at, say, December of 2019, you would see a total of 51 use of force incidents, 47 of which were level 4 at the highest level reporting, 2 of which were level 3, and 2 of which were level 2 for that given month. Now, certainly for that month, you could have more officers involved in more application of force for every incident. So certainly the more granular you look at it, the more increase in the numbers will become. So again, I wanted to explain, so when we talk about force on the charts and what's going up and what's going down, there is some clarity on that. So with the chart that you see before you for uses of force by incident for the last 2 years, looking at the trend line, you can certainly see that force has gone up over time. The main driver of force is the force that is shown in yellow, which is our level 4, again, our lowest level of force, and it has increased at really 2 points throughout the last couple years. It started increasing the end of 2019, going into 2020, due to some retraining that we engaged our officers in to ensure that our reporting was as accurate as possible. And then it went up again in February of 2020 when we enacted a new policy, Special Order 9196, which added a more comprehensive reporting of force, particularly lower level force. That policy certainly captured more force than we used to capture historically in the past. And as you can see, the policy implementation also created a jump in force. That policy required our capture of what we consider a type 32 force. It's a level 4 use of force. And the type 32 was essentially any force that's applied to an individual to overcome resistance. So it's the lowest level of force could essentially be holding somebody on the ground or having to pick somebody up who's non-compliant. And so when we implemented that policy, it created a force increase. We made another policy adjustment around that type of force back in March, and you can see that that force reporting balanced out for the remainder of the year, and even through June and July, lowered when you compare it to February, March, April, and May of 2020. When you look at the other areas of force, the more serious force, level 3s and level 2s, you can see that over time from 2019 to 2020, there have been some decreases. We saw decreases in our taser deployments, which were level 3s during the course of 2020. We also saw some decreases in our level 2 uses of force or intermediate uses of force, again, when you compare 2019 to 2020. Next slide, please. This slide represents specifically our officer-involved shooting incidents over the last 21 years. And this slide tells a very, very important story as far as our efforts to try and engage in better police practices, better policies, better strategies, and more emphasis on de-escalation. And when you look at officer-involved shootings going back to 1999 and throughout even the early 2000s into the mid-2000s, you can see that our officer-involved shootings range from anywhere from 8, 9, 10, maybe in some cases, and you look at 2007, 11 officer-involved shootings in a given year. When you look at 2016 on, you can see our officer-involved shootings have significantly dropped off. We had 0 in 2016, 0 in 2019, 0 in 2021, with 1 in 2017, 1 in 2018, and 2 in 2020. So again, that decrease in officer-involved shootings, as is with our other uses of force incident, is intentional. It's also part of our risk management process as we evaluate not only the actual applications of force through our use of force investigation and EFRB process, we also look at force through our risk management process. And some of the things that we are doing to continue to lower incidents and encounters that engage in use of force outcomes is through training. We recently purchased a new training simulator called the Virtual Training Simulator, or known as VirTra. This is a more enhanced scenario-based training where we can engage officers in different incidents and scenarios to enhance better decision-making. We also worked with California Police Officer Standards and Training to get a mobile version of a virtual simulator so we can bring it to other sides of the city and ensure real-time training when it's needed the most at different lineups, different squad levels. We are starting to roll out a new training program called the Integrated Communications Assessment and Tactics, again, with emphasis on verbal communication with individuals in an attempt to engage in de-escalation. We've also engaged in crisis intervention training, procedural justice training, racial bias training, and other specialized training for our specialized units that engage in high-risk activity around violent offenders. Again, all in efforts to reduce our use of force encounters and engage in de-escalation. Additionally, we also enacted cutting edge or best practice policies when it comes to how we engage armed and unresponsive individuals, how we use designated arrest teams, how we deploy our armored rescue vehicles, and most recently, our policy that prohibits chokeholds or other forms of positional asphyxia. We also work collaboratively on that policy with our police commission, as well as our updated use of force policy. And as I mentioned, our form of accountability and risk management has certainly helped drive down our use of force encounters. So that is just a snapshot of our force trends, what we look at, and what some of these steps we're engaging in to continue our trend of lowering our force encounters. I'll turn it back over to you, Chief Bolton.
Thank you, Assistant Chief Allison. So just for the audience so far, what we hope that you're getting from this is from the stop data slide that you understand that the members of this police department, your commanders here on this call, having a very intentional approach to public safety and traffic safety. We want to stop fewer people, but the right people to make the biggest change and treat people in the way that that they deserve to be treated with respect and through a procedural just lens. Through uses of force and the officer-involved shooting slides, we want you to understand that not only are we intentional on how we are impacting public safety for the better, but doing so in ways that represent best policing practices that not only keep members of the public safe, our officers safe as well, and the suspects themselves safe as well. I'm going to skip to our internal affairs portion, turn this over to Captain Lau, who has not previously been introduced. And I'm going to start you off in just on slide 14, Captain Lau, and if the presenter can go to slide 14 and just talk about this slide and really the importance of being able to capture good internal affairs data, how we use that data to inform better leadership, better policies, better practices, and better decision making in the field. And thank you, Captain Lau.
Thank you, Chief Bolton. Good evening, everyone. My name is Wilson Lau, and I'm the captain of the Internal Affairs Division. I was also born and raised in Oakland, and also, like Captain Hookfin, a fellow Skyline Titan graduate. Nowhere in Oakland, in the Oakland Police Department, is there more of a critical function than the Internal Affairs Division. The Internal Affairs Division conducts fair, objective, and fact-finding investigations to ensure everyone is treated procedurally just, with respect, and given a voice in the process. Before I go on to this slide, I'd like to explain the difference between a complaint and an allegation. A complaint is one single incident of misconduct. For example, if a community member alleged 2 officers wrongfully detained a person, that is one complaint with 2 allegations, one on each officer. This is why you see so many more allegations over complaints. The bar graph shows the top 5 complaints OPD has received. Although there's a 7% increase between the years of 2019 and 2020, you will see the percentages remain relatively close. The top driver here is the performance of duty, 37% compared to 34%. This, unlike other violations, encompasses a wide range of manual of rules violations. Manual of rules, it provides specificity to standards of conduct embodied in the law enforcement officer's code of ethics and the department's values. And the performance of duties encompasses anything from unlawful search, seizure, or arrest, failure to perform duties as required by policy, body-worn camera activation delays, and improper care of property. And as you see, the next one is service complaints. These are the type of complaints that are generally inadequate policies or procedures that would not result in discipline. A common example is sometimes response times. And then next on the list you'll see is no MOR violation, which stands for no manual of rules violation. What that typically means is, say for example, these are complaints that are typically outside police departments. An example would be if there was a false arrest or a car stop misconduct allegation against an outside agency, but it happened in the city of Oakland. Internal Affairs would not have jurisdiction over that outside agency, but we would forward that allegation of misconduct to the respective agencies. And then the next bar is the use of force allegations. As you can see, it's relatively the same at 12%, but an IID investigation would examine the totality of incidents to include what led to, the force itself, and if it was de-escalated properly. And then finally, on the 5th one, you see conduct towards others. You see that there's a 2% decrease from 2019 and 2020. This manual of rules encompasses the essence of procedural justice, how we treat people, to remain professional at all times. Here in IED, we actively monitor these trends. We monitor to ensure that we are providing exceptional service, but also constitutional policing. We take this data and we produce quarterly reports that's shared throughout the police department. So we are constantly reviewing and watching data and making adjustments where needed. And I guess we should go back to the previous slide, or I'm not sure if Chief Bolton, since we skipped that slide.
Actually, Captain Lau, just due to time, we're running over. So I think if slide, what are we on, 14? I think we get the gist of that. And I'm going to actually switch over to our vehicle pursuit trends and turn this over to Deputy Chief Joshi, and we will be monitoring any questions about how we further use internal affairs data in our chat. Deputy Chief Joshi, we're going to start you off and just limit it to slide 15, which shows our vehicle pursuit trends. The floor is yours, sir.
All right. Well, real quick, let me start to kind of give a little bit of background. So again, my name is Nishant Joshi. I'm a Deputy Chief assigned to Bureau of Field Operations, East Oakland. Prior to this, I was actually the department chair for the vehicle, where we reviewed vehicle pursuits and collisions. So as an organization, we recognize that anytime our staff were driving vehicles, that poses a certain level of risk. And that risk increases as our staff responds to emergency calls for service. That means having their lights and sirens activated. And then we also recognize that when they're engaged in a vehicle pursuit, the risk increases that much more. So we endeavor to mitigate the different risk factors through continued training, whether that's in our annual CPT training, quarterly training, or even in some cases, individualized training. We also do incident reviews, and that consists of whenever our staff is involved in a vehicle pursuit or a collision, that is reviewed through their chain, and it ends up finally being, halfway through goes to the board, and the final review and approval is by the chief of police. And then the next way that we look at how to mitigate risk is regularly reviewing our policies to ensure that they are contemporary and they are best practices. The boards are tasked with reviewing pursuits and collision incidents, as I mentioned earlier. The people that are assigned to these boards include captains, lieutenants, sergeants, officers, city attorney, and then subject matter experts, which are typically someone that's assigned to our traffic division. So at these boards, the sergeant will present the details of the incident, and it's considered official testimony. And the board assesses whether or not those details showed the vehicle pursuit or the collision to be in or out of departmental policy. The other things that the board does is that the board identifies deficiencies in performance, policy, training, and equipment. Officers that are found to have been engaged in exemplary performance, the board will call that out as well. After the investigating supervisor completes their testimony, the board will often have follow-up questions. And once those questions are answered, the sergeant is asked to leave the room, and then subject matter expert is called in for follow-up questions. After all testimony is heard, the board deliberates and then comes to that finding. So there are several risk factors that are considered. That includes vehicle or pedestrian traffic, traffic conditions, the location of the pursuit, the safety of the public in the area, safety of the officers involved in the pursuit, the speeds of the officer and the speeds of the pursued person, how familiar the officer is with the area, weather conditions, time of day, how well they're able to communicate on their radios, how well their actual vehicle is performing, whether or not air support was present. We also expect them to consider if they have a ride-along passenger. That's a risk factor on whether or not to continue the pursuit. We look to see whether or not the driver is known, and if the driver is known to be a juvenile or not. During a pursuit, we look to see and consider risk that includes, has an accident already occurred, whether it's minor or major. But that is a factor that is assessed when we're considering risk. Let's see. So additionally, the board will assess what was the original want of the vehicle. Why were we pursuing the vehicle? Our policy says that we can only pursue for violent, forcible crimes that involve the use of a firearm and persons in possession of a firearm. Crimes that are outside those parameters, they receive different strategies, such as surveillance, air support, and even follow-up investigations. Supervisors are required to give approval to pursue, and that approval is required to happen over the radio. Without approval, an officer cannot continue a pursuit. A little bit more on policy in the vehicle code that requires our officers to have their lights and siren activated throughout the entire pursuit. So in the early part of 2020, we found that there was a trend of officers that were failing to activate their sirens, and this was due to stress and familiarity of new equipment that had been installed in the vehicle. So these pursuits were found out of compliance, but we didn't stop there. We pushed out citywide training. As to specific officers, we ensured that they received personalized training. We also require officers to activate their body-worn cameras. With that said, the question is, what is a pursuit? That's any time an officer is attempting to stop a vehicle and the driver fails to stop while using evasive tactics. And then when are we required to terminate a pursuit? Well, it's when the risk factors in continuing the pursuit outweigh the factors in terminating the pursuit. So here we are on slide 15. I wanted to give that foundation. In slide 15, you'll see that there was a steady decline in pursuits from 2018 to 2020. We went from 105 pursuits in 2018 to 80 pursuits in 2019 to 68 pursuits in 2020. We assess risk from the lowest levels to the highest levels in our risk management meetings. What we look for are patterns of risk, patterns of behavior, and then we try to develop strategies to mitigate the risk that we're seeing. So just to give you an idea of some of the strategies that we implement, that includes things like better awareness training. As I mentioned earlier, the annual training, additional personalized training as necessary. If we identify someone who is having some type of a performance issue, then we will individualize training for them. More experience as time continues, we recognize that our officers become much more familiar with their vehicles, conditions, how to drive in these conditions. We also look we try to have our air support readily available, and once our air support is present, we rely on that resource because that significantly mitigates the risk when involved in a pursuit. There's other things like spike strips that have been most recently issued throughout the department. And then even more recently, one of our captains, as Captain Holmgren, he spearheaded the acquisition of Star Chase technology. That is another form of technology that significantly mitigates risk. So if you like, Chief Bolton, I go into slide 16, 17, and 18.
I think Chief Joshi, just due to time, I think maybe 16, and we can use that as a representation of how data within data. So although we had decreased pursuits in our risk management meetings, we saw that a leading cause of pursuits was for robbery-related offenses, and you see in 2020 that that initiating reason, and when we say robbery-initiated reasons, that means the pursuit of robbery vehicles or persons wanted for robbery. In 2020, they dropped significantly. So if you want to talk about the use of risk management, and maybe even there's a captain that can talk about operationally what that means to officers in the field.
Sure. So we implement several strategies. We try to do everything we can to avoid a pursuit. But this slide will show that there was a continued decline. It shows a continued decline in pursuits, and this slide actually breaks down the pursuits by what crimes are we pursuing for. So the biggest drop from 2019 to 2020, as you mentioned, was robberies, and this caused us to look at our robbery arrests to see if those were down. Interestingly enough, as we drilled down on that, we found that For the most part, the numbers remain consistent. For 2019, the robbery clearance rate was about 29%, and then in 2020, the robbery clearance rate was about 26%. So we think that we are still we're using other strategies to locate and apprehend robbery persons that are involved in robberies. However, we are using other strategies to avoid actually getting the pursuits and taking them into custody through other ways. And with that said, I know that we have Captain Jones, who has run several of those types of operations. Captain Jones, is there anything you want to add on some of the strategies that you and your team implement to avoid engaging in vehicle pursuits?
Yeah, I think the thing about pursuits is, and what we've ingrained in our supervisory staff is that don't be afraid to call something off or let something go if it's going to put the public at risk or risk us having a pursuit. In ceasefire, we haven't had a pursuit in 2.5 years, and we try to set up our tactics in a way to totally avoid having a pursuit. And when you operate like that, and you have good supervisors who understand the importance of eliminating the possibility of pursuits by tactically positioning people in a certain place to avoid pursuits, then that's in everyone's interest, and that's what we try to do, not just in ceasefire, but in all of the street teams that are out there, developing and coming up with tactics that can put our officers in a position to eliminate the possibility of a pursuit.
Great, thank you, Captain Jones. DC Bolton, I can continue on.
If you want to touch on the collision data, and then I think maybe we can.
Sure. Can we go to slide 17? Actually, I'm sorry, slide 18. So slide 18 shows that the Oakland Police Department tracks all vehicle collisions that its members are involved in while driving a city-owned, rented, or leased vehicle. All vehicle collisions are reviewed to identify any reoccurring trends which need to be addressed for the safety of the public or the actual members of OPD. The department tracks if the vehicle collisions resulted in injuries or fatalities. Injuries are distinguished between minor injuries requiring things like basic first aid care and those requiring significant care at a medical facility. So if somebody has to go to the emergency room. Vehicle collisions resulting in fatalities require an additional level of investigation by a team specially trained in fatal vehicle collisions. The department investigates whether the officer is at fault for the collision, which is determined by the traffic investigators, and then it's reviewed by the department chain of command. The department then also tracks when an officer is involved in a vehicle collision, which is the result of or occurs during a pursuit. And then the findings are defined. So they'll come to a finding of whether the collision was preventable, meaning the officer could have prevented this collision from occurring, meaning the officer was at fault, or non-preventable. So those are the two findings that come out of these vehicle collisions. The trend line shows that preventable collisions, meaning officers being at fault, has been steadily decreasing. In 2020, in speaking with our traffic division, just to give some numbers, 20 of the collisions were from backing or colliding into the rear of a vehicle, mostly backing. And then 30 are from an unsafe change of course, either on the part of the officer or citizens. So these are kind of trends that we look for. If we see that we're having an uptick in minor collisions due to backing or things like that, then we will give additional training. We'll have our officers spend some time in our vehicle operations training to just practice backing a vehicle to avoid minor collisions. And that concludes my presentation on this slide.
I think it's currently actually 7:20 on the nose, so that leaves us 10 minutes. We've been answering questions in the chat as we've gone along. I think I'm going to end with a question to Chief Armstrong, or actually let me lead with this. For Chief Armstrong, if you're ready for this, I think it's appropriate for your level. Do you teach your police officers and staff why you value certain stops over others to make sure they share or at least understand your vision of policing?
Yes. So we consistently make sure that our area commanders are giving our officers the priorities for their particular area. Our 5 districts all represent different areas in the city, and they have different dynamics, different geographic locations, different issues face different areas. And so the area commanders decide what is the most appropriate focus for their particular officers to address crime. But it's always data driven. Our crime analysis division does a really a good job of making sure that they provide us weekly reports that help us better understand what crimes are occurring in the community. It shows us where the hot spots in all of the particular violent crimes are occurring. Where are we seeing the largest number of shootings? Where are we seeing our robberies occurring at? Where are we seeing our vehicle burglaries? All of the crimes that we are focused on a consistent basis. We are getting that data from our crime analysis, and that's where we're focusing our attention at. That's where our officers' efforts should be. And so we are looking at this data on a weekly basis and not allowing officers to just continue to follow the data that was given to them or provided to them the prior week. And so we just want to make sure that we continue to feed them information and data to support their decisions around who they stop and who they make contact with and what they should be focused on. And so they are consistently, given this data and given direction. And that's how we make sure that we can hold them accountable to the strategies that we have asked them to actually follow through on. So that, that is how we move forward with that. Chief Bolton.
Thank you. And there were a few questions in the chat that weren't exactly on topic, but are somewhat exciting for other reasons. How tall do you have to be a police officer, for instance? But that means that we have someone in the audience who is thinking about joining us, and that is commendable. So I will direct you to oaklandca.gov, where we have a recruiting section, and we would very much encourage you as we are trying to build the police department that we feel our community deserves. Any takers at all with interest, we would be glad to spend that time with you and have you join us. And that being said, there was one other question I'm seeing. It was really about how to report dangerous vehicle driving. I know that sideshows have been a topic. Actually, the mayor's office helped us organize a town hall specifically on sideshow. And that's actually another great example how that relates to risk management. Our intent with sideshow was obviously to achieve our mission of ending dangerous vehicle activities that bring not only nuisance and noise, but danger in terms of vehicle injuries, pedestrian injuries, as well as shootings, unfortunately, and illegal firearm possession and use. Our secondary goal was, though, to do outreach, warning, and collaborative problem solving with departments of transportation members, so that if we could make environmental designs to diminish or mitigate sideshow activity, we're all for it. If we can use social media or other legal remedies or leverage to influence organizers of sideshow to be more successful in getting them not to come to the city of Oakland to participate in that dangerous activity, we're all for it. Our actual intent is really not to detain and cite and have to tow vehicles, but to do the work with our partners to have that illegal activity be avoided from the onset. Because ultimately that is fewer stops, that's fewer detentions, that's fewer cars being towed that may very well be used to get family members or others to work. We don't want to create harm, we want to bring safety. So a good segue. The answer to that question, though, is if you see vehicle activity that is actively endangering members of the public, that is absolutely a call to 911. Regardless of the jurisdiction, it will be routed to the appropriate jurisdiction. If it is about chronic speeding, which is another way that our officers address public safety neighborhood issues, then we encourage you to call our non-emergency line, and that is 510-777-3333. What we do with chronic activity is, again, we look for, are there ways for roadway designs? Are there ways that we can diminish or mitigate the danger that that vehicle activity is bringing to the neighborhood? And ultimately, we go to neighborhood councils and see if we have any partners that are willing to make that traffic condition a priority for that neighborhood. I'll also take this opportunity to direct people. If you found any portion of tonight's meeting interesting, you want to continue the conversation, the best way to get involved is through your local neighborhood, your local beat. I'd encourage you to go to oaklandca.gov. There's a section there about our neighborhood services division, which is now housed under our city administrator's office. But our community resource officers, these are officers that are dedicated and assigned to police beats, smaller neighborhoods, where we're not only concerned with the more serious and violent crime that is unfortunately impacting all of Oakland, but we are giving attention to those neighborhood priorities as well, making sure that people are listened to, have voice in terms of what priorities exist in their smaller neighborhoods. So please find out when your neighborhood council meets, find a way to get involved. Our community resource officers and our neighborhood service coordinators would love to meet you and further involve you. I don't know if the mayor is still with us. Madam Mayor, would you like to end with any closing remarks? And then I guess I'll end actually with Chief Armstrong after that. But again, thank you for arranging this opportunity with us. The floor is once again yours, ma'am.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope all you data geeks out there enjoyed digging through the numbers, looking at trends over time to see how this police department is absolutely transforming. I feel like I'm repeating Chris Bolton to say that there is more work to do, but we are here to do it with you. Please continue the conversation. We would love your feedback on what you found interesting about this last hour and a half and what you found boring, what made your eyes glaze over. That is important for us to know how we can actually make this interesting and meaningful to people who care about safety, about reimagining public safety, and most of all, who care about Oakland. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. And thank you all the staff that made this happen. I know this was a huge amount of work. It is a great way of connecting and translating very technical information to be digestible by the average Oaklander. I thank you so much for your incredible dedication now and always. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good night and be safe.